All right, hey everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about VMware Cloud Foundation, kind of some what's new along with some of the basic SDDC Manager operations. So here's our agenda for the day, or the session, I should say. We're going to go a little bit of the captain introductions, myself and Jeff here. We're going to talk a little bit about the lab, how we constructed it, what's all in the lab. We'll do a little overview of VCF. So show of hands, who here use VCF today? All right, so this might not be a huge shocker for you in the beginning here, but obviously as you go through the lab, we'll go ahead and share what's new, and you'll have a chance to play with those features, and we'll be able to answer some questions as you walk around. And then we'll go through, just give you the lab time to work. So my name is Chris Horning. I've joined VMware in about 2017. I've supported as a technical adoption manager, so I'm a staff technical adoption manager, supporting customers in multiple different industries. Currently, my dedicated customer is a medical device manufacturer. Prior to that, I've worked with customers in the utility space, the software space, and then kind of general distribution. I've been working with VMware Solutions since about 2008. Typical family, married, 2 children, 2 dogs, and a cat. That keeps me plenty busy. When I'm not, we try to enjoy traveling. We've been hitting the national parks lately. We find nature beautiful. And then, of course, love dabbling with some woodworking and just all around the house projects. Right? Plenty to keep me busy. And then with me today, we have Jeff.
Hello, my name's Jeff Wong. So if I sound funny, that's because I'm a Malaysian-born Australian living in the US now. So bear with me. So I've been with VMware about 7.5 years now, and I've been working on VCF for the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years, solid. And I'm part of the VCF platform engineering team. I'll be around to assist Chris, and any of the questions that you may have along the way, I'll be roaming around your desk throughout this session. So thank you and welcome.
Perfect, thanks Jeff. All right, so let's get into a little bit about the lab. So constructing the lab, if you're familiar with our hands-on labs, these are all nested environments. So this lab today is based on VCF 5.0, and we're including the basic components such as vSphere, vCenter, vSAN. We also pepper in some of our ARIA automation as well as some of the Tanzu components, so you can kind of kick the tires on those. We do have the largest pod in Hands-On Labs catalog, so what does that mean? That means every time we spin up one of our pods, we're consuming 83 vCPUs, and we're consuming 368 gigs of memory, as well as about 3 terabytes of storage. So every one of you that are consuming a lab, that's what you're consuming inside of our data center and our clouds. So from the time of release of VCF, typically our VCF release for us to go through and update this cycle or for this pod is about a 12 to 14 weeks. So we're basically starting fresh, deploying new ESXi hosts, building that infrastructure, installing VCF, and then we have to go through and include any new additional features, any of our manual updates, et cetera. So that takes us a little while to do. As far as how do we use the lab, we use the lab for things like this, for our marquee events. We also use it for internal training and some demos and testing. So it's a quite heavily used lab, and it comes in rather handy for us. So this lab, again, as you're familiar with VCF for many of you, if not, we have sort of a prescriptive bill of materials. So in this case, the VCF 5.0 release came with SDDC Manager 5.0. It included vSphere 8.0 U1A. vSAN, of course, is paired with that, typically in that release. NSX 4.1, so that was a big update. And then, of course, the optional components mapped to, at the time of release, the ARIA Suite 8.10. So what's new with the pod this year is obviously we've moved to 5. The big move with 5 was moving into our vSphere 8 realm of products. So if you're a consumer of the 4.x series, right, that's going to be based on vSphere 7, vSAN 7, and NSX 3.x, right? So that's one of the big changes this year as we've built out this and with VCF 5. Just a quick note for those that are going down for that subscription path. At the initial release of VCF 5, we don't support the subscription of the VCF Plus. We expect that here coming up in Q3 of fiscal year 24. So pretty quick. Here's a little bit of the nested environments, kind of give you an idea of how the lab is constructed and how we build it. So what you're sitting at or what you're working in is called the main console. You can kind of see in the upper left corner of the screen there. And that's plumbed into, or in every one of these pods, we have what we call a vPod router. Now that vPod router has multiple VLANs, and then what we start to do from there is we create those nested ESXi hosts. And so that's kind of that layer one nested virtualization. And then inside of those nested hosts, right, that's where we actually build our vCenter components, deploy the ARIA components, and everything that makes up the VCF environment. So we just kind of want to give you a little insight of how all that's plumbed and mapped in case you were curious. You're also taking what's called the 2446 series lab. It's all VCF based. So as you can see on the screen here, we have a couple different SKUs or additional lab SKUs. The one you're doing today is the 01. This is kind of our basic VCF functions as well as some day two operations. We also have our -02 module. This one is focused on a little bit more of diving into NSX along with or stacked, inside of VCF. You'll be doing some deployments and some functionality of kind of segments and automation there. Our 03 SKU is based on ARIA automation, so using ARIA automation on top of the VMware Cloud Foundation stack to deploy some applications with pre-populated networks, but also networks that you deploy on the fly. And then our last module that we've got out in the catalog so far is the -04, and that's where we dig a little bit more into Tanzu, cover some of the scalability, some of the integration, and again, leveraging the holistic VMware Cloud platform. So those are available in the catalog today if you wanted to go take those later in the self-paced lab area, or once they become publicly available, you'll be able to find them in the catalog on our HOL website. All right, so now we'll kind of dig into some of the basics of what we plan to cover, kind of the functions of VCF. So again, I'll kind of cruise through this slide because many of you in the audience today are familiar with VCF, but again, the whole purpose of VCF is to really build that consistent infrastructure and have the speed to market or speed to production in your environment. So having a standardized architecture, kind of taking our full stack approach, so that's using everything, pretty much everything in our portfolio from a core functionality. It's tested and validated by engineers to make sure that the version interoperability is there, so that the version of NSX you're using is fully compatible and interoperable with that of vCenter and ESXi. We're giving you basically a simplified experience and of some built-in security. So the biggest thing that comes out of VCF is automation, right? That's the key focus. How can we automate your day-to-day actions? And we can do that not only through just compiling these and building out our VCF environments, but we can do that by adding in that security and following our recommended practices of how to deploy those platforms or those different components inside of VCF. So to successfully optimize and modernize your data center, these are some of the key kind of constructs, right, or the 5 critical competencies that we look for. Those are the infrastructure transformation, the application security mobility, intelligent application delivery, right, aka Tanzu, as well as developer-ready infrastructure, and of course the ability to do multi-cloud. So VCF is a key component or a critical linchpin to that, not only on-prem, but also in our clouds as they leverage sort of the VCF stack or mentality to deploy their consistent infrastructure. All right. So, how do we start? VMware Cloud Foundation automated deployment, our initial deployment. Basically, we need to start with your customer-provided networking. So historically, we used to be very specific on what kind of networking gear when VCF first came out. Now we're pretty agnostic as far as what you use. And we basically need some vSAN-ready nodes. So the minimum to get started is effectively 4 nodes. We'll provide you a checklist right out in our documentation. Here's a deployment checklist, the things that you need to do to prepare those nodes. Once you've prepared those nodes, then what we'll look at doing is standing up the Cloud Builder appliance, right? This is the appliance that has all the bits to deploy all the products and all the automation built into it. So you'll go ahead and you'll fill out this input document. This is where you're going to be putting in all your IP addresses, your VLANs, your passwords, your host names, et cetera, right? So spending a majority of time up front getting that accurate makes the deployment much easier and quicker. Once you have that built out, you'll feed that to the Cloud Builder. It's going to go through the automation, and it's going to spit out at the end effectively what we call our management domain. That management domain is made up of the SDDC Manager, your vCenter server, and your NSX Manager. We call that our management components, right? Now from there, we'll take a little bit deeper into what is the management domain. Well, the management domain is purpose-built. It's effectively created during that initial deployment. It requires that minimum of 4 hosts, and it does require that you use vSAN as sort of what we call the principal storage, right? That's the primary storage that's used for that environment. Now you do have the ability to do secondary storages, and we'll talk about secondary storage types. We'll talk about that a little bit later here. And as you can see, We also have, inside of that management domain, we have the ability to do the optional components, right? That's where we talk about that ARIA suite. So ARIA Lifecycle Manager, operations, automation, operations for logs, those tools that are really help you round out the visibility into your environment to make it easier to manage. Then we also have the opportunity or option to do customer workloads in that management domain. Now, you maybe have heard that called a consolidated deployment or a consolidated domain. And in that case, what we do is we leverage resource pools to ensure that we always have the right resources for things like NSX Manager, our edges, and our management components, right? Because we don't want vCenter to be down because the customer workloads have taken over if they're commingling in that domain. Don't necessarily have to run workloads in there, but obviously you can. You have the capability to. Typically what we see with our customers is that we'll have an actual management domain, but then we'll start to build out what we call additional workload domains. So what does that mean? That means we need more hosts, right? So we have to have additional capacity. And you'll see every workload domain, we actually deploy a vCenter and NSX Manager. That's unique to that workload domain. It's kind of a boundary, if you will. Now, historically, those vCenters will be in linked mode. And we got a slide, we'll talk about one of the new features with VCF 5 and what we've done in that space. But what we'll do is we'll spin up those hosts, we'll add them into what we call our workload domain, and then you'll have the same capability to run your existing workloads. Now let's say you need to add another workload domain. Now you may do a workload domain for multiple different reasons. You may do it for things like that the developers need their own pod of resources, or hey, we want to do VDI, right? So we have a different host type with some GPUs. Or we just know that VDI has a completely different profile, and we want that to be in its own vCenter so that it doesn't impact the rest of our application, web servers, et cetera. So then maybe we want to add, a second workload domain. Same thing, we're going to go ahead and spin up a third vCenter in that instance for that second workload domain, and a third instance of NSX managers for that as well. And then you have the ability to run all your different application workloads in that space there too. All right, I missed the edges there. So one of the things that you can see on the screen that calls out that the edges are optional. So when you deploy this, you'll have an edge built in your management domain, and you can choose whether or not you want to use that existing edge, or if you want to build out new edges for those additional workload domains. So that kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility when it comes to networking, where you're peering, maybe where your gear is located, and what you need to attach to get north, southbound out of that environment. I'm going to skip this slide. It's really kind of, again, what is that value prop of VCF, which is really just the standardization, automation, simple scaling, and of course, lifecycle management. And we're going to dig into sort of a couple of those topics here. So how do we scale? What does that look like? So depending upon how you do things inside of your organization or how things are broken out, you maybe have different silos, right? You have your team that's building out the initial infrastructure, standing up the gear in the data center. Maybe in that case, that fits into this Cloud Foundation admin component. So what we're going to do is prepare a couple hosts, right? Get them ready to go. And that process is called commissioning. So by commissioning the host, we basically check it, prep it, import it into the VCF inventory, right? And at that point, it's available for use or consumption. And then from there, you maybe hand it off to your operations team, depending upon how that's divvied up. And they have a couple different workflows that we'll review here real quick. They have the ability to expand an existing cluster, add a new cluster, create a workload domain, or create an automated workflow to create an NSX edge. So going through those, what does that look like? Here's that host commissioning process. We'll start by taking the ESXi host, bring it into that inventory, commission it, and then a couple of the automated pieces that it does, or that we have the ability to do, is leverage sort of a bulk import, either by IP or FQDN. You get to choose what kind of storage. Now again, like I said, that management workload domain has to have vSAN. Our other workload domains, they can leverage other components like vVols, NFS, VMFS over Fiber Channel, et cetera, right? So you got a little more flexibility with your storage. We also then have the ability to define a network pool, and those network pools have the IPs that are used for things like vMotion, the TEPs, et cetera. And then we can have that capacity is ready to go and be added in those other fashions. So what does it look like to create a workload domain? We'll just talk about a couple pieces of the automation here, and this is why the magic sauce, right, of VCF. So we can effectively, by creating a workload domain, it automatically creates a new vCenter. You have your choice of how you want to update and manage that from a lifecycle perspective. You have your traditional VUM, right? Your baseline method that many of you are probably used to. But we also have the ability to now do, right, the image-based management. Now, that's a per workload sort of designation. So if you pick it for workload domain, every cluster inside of that workload domain does need to maintain that update methodology, right? And again, we talked about the choice of storage. You'll basically pick the hosts and then pick whether you want to use an existing network fabric, right? Like I talked about using that edge in that existing network, or if you want to create a net new NSX manager and edge. And then once you do that, VCF does its thing, right? And you come out on the other end with a new workload domain. So for many of you that have done this for a while, we're automating well over 50 actions, right? So you don't have to go into every host. You don't have to set the TEP network, the vMotion network, and all the IPs and subnets. So it really removes a lot of margin for error because let's say you're adding 16 hosts. Well, 16 times 50 is a pretty large number of actions that you have to complete manually. Let's just go ahead and do it through VCF automated, right? Now, the other side of this is, let's say we want to create a new cluster, right? So you can have multiple clusters within a workload domain. So again, maybe that's, you have a dev cluster, different host type, you have a test cluster, or just your prod cluster, or maybe you have a cluster that's got some, so smaller procs that run, database or, dedicated license software, and you kind of need to build those constructs from a licensing perspective. So it's, again, very similar process. You're going to go ahead and dip into that pool of host capacity that you've commissioned, and we're going to go ahead and just build out that new cluster. So again, if you pick vSAN, it does all the creation of that vSAN cluster. You end up with the proper vSAN data store. It's all configured, ready to go. And then you'll see, right, we dip into the inventory, we take that, and we build out cluster number 2. Very similar thing, right? We just want to scale an existing cluster. Again, it's all about automation, right? How can we do these things repeatable without having that error? And VCF helps you do that. Any questions so far on some of the automation capabilities? I think it's all relatively thumbs up on safe. Yeah? Cool. All right, so how many of you also, in addition to being VI admins, are NSX or network admins, right? Yeah, couple, yeah. Yeah, you dabble, right? So for those that maybe aren't super familiar, and if I were to say, hey, I need you to go deploy a NSX edge and make sure you set up BGP peering and get that up and going, right? So that we can have traffic in and out of that environment. Many of you maybe can't do that, right? Many of our regular admins don't do both vSphere, vCenter, and NSX. So we have a workflow that helps you do that, basically the same kind of thing as the initial deployment. We're going to run you through a wizard in vCenter, where it's going to tell you, here's my inputs that I need, including your ASN, your peer IDs, and then you just go ahead and get started. So you'll feed it that information. It's going to go through, deploy your tier 1 or your tier 0 for your north-south bound, set up the layer 3 adjacency. Now, we support BGP through the automated build out of that. However, we can do OSPF. It's just a manual configuration after the fact. You get your choice of small, medium, or large node type as you're deploying your VCF. And then you can pick whether you want to do an active-active configuration, which is something that typically you'll do if you're using the Tanzu capabilities on top, or if you just want to do an active standby, maybe for your basic traffic. And then you can see here we do that, build it out in cluster 1. And again, typically the edge is a cluster construct, right? And so if we have clusters in disparate areas, like maybe you have a remote cluster and you're managing it via VCF, if all the latency and maximums are well within the bounds there, then we'll put an edge that's local to that cluster, and then that way it can peer with a different subset of northbound routers. Same thing with cluster 2. Maybe that's in a separate data center or a separate location, and you want to manage it that way. All right, now we'll go ahead and dig into the slide here, which is a little bit of the evolution, if you will. Not an all-inclusive list, but some of the key components as we've moved, right, from our 4.x or 4.0 into 5.0. So one of the big things here is really the full stack upgrade. So this is the ability to, historically, if you were a VCF 3.x customer, right, you know that there really wasn't a great in-place upgrade path. right? You had to work with our support team to get through that upgrade. So what we've done now is we have in-place upgrades to go from 4.x, on the next slide we'll review, through straight into 5, right? The other thing that I mentioned earlier is the ability to do the isolated workload domains. So if you've been a VCF customer, you know that historically our max has been 15, right? That's one vCenter basically for our management domain, and then the rest could be workload domains, and that was a limitation of linked mode, right? So within vCenter, we can only link so many vCenters together. Now we have the ability to go beyond 16 and or have isolated domains, so we can scale up to 25 inside of a singular VCF or SDDC Manager deployment. So it's a pretty big scale. So what does that isolated SSO look like? Well, what you see on the screen there is basically what we've had coming up to 5.0. So the singular SSO domain with one management domain and up to 14 workload domains. Now what we've introduced is the ability to do the isolated domains. So you can do that alongside. So you can still have, if you have the need for linked vCenter or linked domains, you can still deploy those. But let's say you have a separate business unit or a separate group that needs an isolated vCenter, an isolated non-shared SSO domain, then you now have the ability to do that. And we can do those, one of them, two of them. Basically what we have is the ability to go into any combination that nets us in the middle, no more than 15 in one particular, but then we could have up to separate 24 effective workload domains and SSO domains. Now, obviously, inside of each of those domains, you have the ability to configure those for Active Directory or LDAP integration, right, independently. So maybe, again, you have a test, domain with test servers. You want to keep that in a separate workload domain, so you're always using test accounts. So they log into that vCenter with their test account that's linked to that test AD environment as well. And then thou shall never touch production effectively, right? All right, so this is the slide here that talks about our direct upgrades or in-place upgrades. So we have the ability to go from VCF 4.3.x straight into VCF 5, right, or anything beyond that 4.3. And so for those that have been through some of those pain points of upgrades in the past, we're really trying to remove those barriers and make this a very much user function to go ahead and do the updates on your own. Question. Let's get your mic here real quick.
So right now I'm on 4.5, but my vCenter is, I did an async patch because of a 0-day vulnerability.
Yep.
Can I still upgrade to 5.0?
Yes, yeah, so that's the beauty of, thank you for using the async patch tool.
Yeah.
What the async patch tool does is really helps us maintain and update the manifests. And the manifest is basically like, this is the list of approved software and build numbers that we can upgrade from. So if you would have just patched out of band without that patch tool, it wouldn't have updated that manifest file. And then if you would have gone to do the update, it wouldn't have succeeded because it would have seen you as a non-compatible version of VSI or vCenter, right? So.
And then second question is, I'm with DoD, but we haven't gone to 8 yet or got approved.
Okay.
So does 4.5 still support vSphere 7 until end of life, or?
Yeah, 4.5.1, right, is our latest. Sorry, I'm cutting in and out a little bit. Ultimately, yes, that will support 7 through the, it should consist through the end of general support on 7, I believe. I would double check the compatibility lifecycle matrix just for the VCF support date, but that would be the first place to start. But I think we cover it mostly through the lifecycle of 7.x. So. Any other questions? All right, so like we talked about some of the different components that are built out in the deck and through the different modules, one of the things we'd like to share with you guys is we have this sort of toolkit. We call it the VCF Holodeck Toolkit. Has anyone heard of it? We got one? Okay, so if you like the experience here of what you're doing in hands-on labs and want a lab to play in, what this allows you to do is on a singular host, kind of create this nested lab in your own environment. So you can kick the tires on things like upgrades, or hey, I want to rip a host out and see what the behavior is, right? It gives you a place to safely test and kind of see what that is. Now, it is nested, and as you saw the resources of our nested lab, it does require a pretty substantial host to run it on. but this is something that we'd like to share with you guys. So if you want to get back, or when you get back from the show, you have the ability to maybe spin this out. As you can see on the top there, we do have both the version 1.3, which is still that 4.x stream of VCF, and then we also have the 2.0, which dips you into VCF 5.x. All right, so a couple other nuggets here for you guys today. If you've never heard of SDDC Commander, you can follow us on Twitter, now X, whatever the naming convention is there. Go ahead and give us a follow. We try to post with updates and different notes about the VCF stack and what we're doing. And also you can dig deeper not only on vSphere, vSAN, but also VCF on our core.vmware.com website. It's a great set of resources if you've never taken a peek. All right, with that, we're kind of going to flip it over to you guys to start going through the lab. Feel free to skip ahead to any of the modules. If you want to start, with the first module, feel free. If you want to skip ahead, just look at the table of contents and go from there. And Jeff and I will be milling around to answer any questions that you have related to VCF. Thanks, everyone.